Hello everyone, Master Xeon1001 here, and in this video we'll be talking about some of the update changes that have taken place for Boxcutter 718_7. For this update we attempted to improve upon Autodepth, breaking it out into its own parameter. We also added a hotkey to switch between the solvers of exact and fast on the fly. Extraction fade also makes a return, and sound effects have been expanded in this update where you can now cycle between the various sound effects available. We've also made improvements with the Pi, View Extrude, redesigned the snap panel, and this also introduces the new dynamic grid, which takes the place of our previous dynamic grid, which was beginning to show its age. There's also been improvements with the fade, and there's more than enough to keep you entertained in this particular update. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into it and see what there's new to explore in Boxcutter 718_7. So generally when using Boxcutter, first things first is you want to make sure you selected the object that you wish to edit. Right now we're undercut and our mode is set to box, which means that if we click and drag, we begin performing a draw on the surface. And if we release the left mouse button, we can then jump to the extrusion process where we can specify how much depth we want or just completely cut through the object. We can also take this time to press a hotkey like B in order to bevel. We could also press T in order to add solidification, and we could even press Tab in order to pause the shape and have it in a state where we can freely transform it prior to its applying. And at this time, now that we are finished, we can also click, and that now completes the operation. That's basically draw in a nutshell. However, in general use, you'll be able to just draw and specify your depth very quick and be done. But there's more to it than that. You can also draw shape in 2D, just click without giving it any sort of depth, and you'll basically perform what's called a laser cut. But in addition to that, we've also attempted things like quick execute, which attempts to streamline the behavior of extrusion into an even more simplified process for speed. However, today we'll be talking about Autodepth. If we click on the behavior sprocket underneath shape, we see that Autodepth has now been broken out into its own parameter set. So if we enable Autodepth, this means that now whenever we begin drawing a shape, it will begin giving it depth in the middle of the draw process based off of the length or the width of the shape. In this case, it's actually using the shortest edge to determine the depth. However, there is a parameter available, of course, to flip this in the event that you want it to behave the opposite way. But just drawing with Autodepth just offers you an alternative way to work, and of course you're still able to do things like press tab in order to pause the shape and begin adjusting the dots in order to adjust your extrusion depth to be something more fine. But most of the time that you are using Autodepth, you're just using it to just quickly draw shapes as you see me doing here without having to really specify the depth. And then like I said, you can go in and also choose to reverse what you're doing with the sizes. So now we're actually using the longest edge in order to determine the amount that we're cutting through. So we see it's actually cutting a lot further than it was previously. In addition to using it with box, we can also press W to use it with wedge if we're wanting to just auto cut some wedges in here. However, because of the amount of depth that is being given, it's giving us an unsatisfactory wedge at this time. So the next one that we'll talk about is the custom proportions, where by having this on, it means that whenever you're using custom cutter, it will constrain the shape to be 1:1 without having to hold shift. So to show this in action, we'll jump over to custom cutter and we'll just remove whatever custom cutter is there and turn off wedge, so it's just regular custom. And basically now whenever we draw the shape, we see that we're able to freely adjust it, and the amount of extrusion that's happening is actually based off of the depth of the longest edge. So if we hold shift, we see that we're able to get a 1:1 draw, which is just a much better way of using custom cutter when it comes to using it with Autodepth. However, if we go in and actually enable this parameter, that means that whenever we use custom cutter without anything marked as the cutter, it will actually give it that 1:1 depth automatically, giving us a much better result. So that's just a little bit about Autodepth in a nutshell. We'll jump back over to box for just a moment, where we'll now be able to talk about the depth multiplier. So right now, whenever it's calculating the depth based off the longest edge, it's using a 1:1 calculation for it. However, you can actually fandangle that particular calculation by adjusting this parameter. So now that it's 10, that means that the depth is now 10 times what it was normally going to be before. And the same of course goes if we start fractionalizing this with decimals. So let's change this to 0.2. And this means that now we're actually drawing this with a much more shallow depth than before. And we can still pause this with tab and grab the bottom dot and adjust the depth to something more fine. But now we're actually able to draw much more shallow boxes than we were previously if we're trying to do something that isn't completely penetrative to the surface. And that really, in a nutshell, is what you can expect with Autodepth as of this latest update. Autodepth also supports join to a better extent, so if we press D and we switch over to box, we see that we're cutting utilizing a box. However, I'm going to bring the depth up just a little bit, and we'll press B to bevel it. And from here, we'll just enable snapping, which will give us our dots, and we'll just utilize our dots. And if we press J to switch over to join, we see that now whenever you press J to change it, it actually flips the shape on the surface, which will allow you to get a join that's actually additive to the surface. In this case, the join came up a little bit tall, so let's go under our auto depth and change this to something like 0.2. And now whenever we draw our shape and we press J, we see that it actually pops out at only a fraction of what it was before. So let's just click to apply. Let's draw another cut, but this time give it depth, and we'll bring that down, press B, and perform that cut. Press J to make this one cut on the outside. We'll left click plus right click in order to activate dots, or press tab and just make that one a little bit of a notch that penetrates both surfaces. And we could just keep drawing in this fashion, just making modifications as needed in order to get the shape to cut in the surface to the amount of depth that's actually required for this situation. But just letting you know that join now is supported inside of Autodepth. So here I am in an older version of Blender, and we'll just go inside of here and activate Autodepth in its former parameter location. And we're already inside of wedge box, and now we're drawing a wedge box utilizing Autodepth. So it was supported before, but notice how as the box gets smaller, the wedge actually changes. This is something that I did not want happening. It was one of the goals with static wedge in the latest updates of Boxcutter. So if we minimize this and we go back to the current 718.7 and we begin performing a box cut, we can press W to jump to wedge, W to change the angle of wedge. We see that now the wedge is no longer changing whenever you shrink it in. And this was something that was a bit of a minor annoyance, but was definitely something that I wanted to see get resolved. So now we're able to just use wedge with Autodepth, and we'll no longer have to worry about issues of the wedge being recalculated in the middle of the draw operation. There were some cases where wedge calculation was a good idea, but during draw was just not one of them. So I'm happy to see that that has finally been rectified. A long time bug that happened with Autodepth and knife that kept it from going prime time was that knife just did not have any effect on shapes and would not leave any sort of line indications on it, which is what you would normally expect when you're using Autodepth. In fact, we turn it off, we see that this is what's actually supposed to happen, but whenever Autodepth was enabled, knife wouldn't actually have any effect on the mesh. So this was something that we considered a little bit of a problem. If we go into the current version and we enable Autodepth and jump over to knife and press Alt V to enable wireframe, we see that knife now performs on the surface as you would expect whenever utilizing Autodepth. So just letting you know that everything has been checked with Autodepth, and we did our best to make it as performant as possible in every situation, working across every tool, even if it doesn't make any sense. But knife with Autodepth just has its own sense of adventure to it. So just letting you know that if you do get in with knife and Autodepth, that it does now support the surface. Starting this example, we're using Blender 2.83.15, which is the latest version of the LTS. So if we expand the behavior drop down and we go under behavior, we see that there's no option here for us to change the Boolean algorithm. And what this means is that if we were to draw a shape and then we go and look at the modifier, we see that there's no option for us to change what sort of Boolean system is being used. And that's because this is a limitation of older versions of Blender 2.8. So in Blender 2.92 and up, in this case I'm using Blender 3.0 with the latest version of Boxcutter, you'll see under behavior that there's an option for choosing the Boolean solver. So you can jump between fast and exact on the fly. In fact, in HardOps you can also change the solver in the settings up top, which I'll go over a little bit more in depth in a second. So let's just draw a cut, and we're here at the bottom. We'll press B in order to bevel. We'll press J to switch to join, and let's just click and apply. And we see that this cut was performed using the fast system. If we go over to the Boolean modifier, we see that there's an option for the solver where you can change the solver between fast and exact just on the fly. However, you can now do this also inside of Boxcutter by just pressing Alt E. So I'm just drawing a cut, pressing J, and we'll press Alt E in order to change the Boolean algorithm that's being used, and we see that this is now working as intended. So we'll draw another one. Tab, press B for bevel, press J to turn it into a join, and click, and we see that it retains the settings that were set up on the last cut that we're using. So whenever you press Alt E in order to change your solver, just know that it also changes it for good. So here we are beveling. We can press Alt E to change back to fast where it shows it as a notification. We can press J to turn it to join, and we see that fast isn't going to work out for us here. So by pressing Alt E, we can actually change the algorithm being used, click and apply, and we see that this cut was able to work out. So traditionally in Boxcutter, you could perform a series of cuts, and then in the event that you wanted to repeat them somewhere else, you are able to, but there was no feedback for it. So here I'm just performing some cuts in order to create something actually worth extracting. And now that we're ready to extract, we'll just draw a box over this, press Y, and notice that once I extract, nothing happens. It just fades out and the surface has been taken. However, we've been jumped over to custom, and the cutter that we extracted has now been made our custom cutter, which means that we're able to draw, hold shift in order to draw it 1-to-1, press R, rotate it, and then extrude it down. And we've now repeated our custom cut that we created over here in the form of just one maneuver using the power of custom cutters. So we'll just rotate this cutter, place it here, bring it down. We can even press V in order to array, press GX in order to move it on to X. We'll draw one more, rotate it 90 degrees, bring it down, bring it out to depth by holding shift. And just like that, we're able to use custom cutter with extraction. However, we've always wanted a little bit more feedback to be present whenever you're performing extraction. To show how it was again previously, we'll perform our extraction and we see that just nothing, it just fades out. However, now we've extracted this piece and we're able to repeat it, but there's no visual feedback to really set the experience apart. So this was something we aimed to rectify in the latest version of Boxcutter. So right now I'm in cut and box, and we'll just perform a series of cuts. Press D, switch over to circle, press J to switch to join, switch back over to box, press W to begin wedging our box, and we'll just jump over to box again to just purify box back to box. And now we can perform our extraction. So if we now perform an extraction, notice that now there's visual feedback showing some geometry fading out to let us know what exactly was extracted. So with this, we can now draw our shape, rotate it, and begin doing the exact same things we were doing before. In fact, to show extraction again, we'll just extract just this little sliver, and we see that the extraction piece just faded out, letting us know that we've extracted it. And that is all there is to it. And when it comes to extraction fade time, under display there's an option for extraction fade where you can choose how long you want to fade. So we could set this to say something like 100, and let's just press D, switch over to box, and we'll just extract this area, and we see that with 100 fade it's nothing more than a blink. And if we set it to 0, it will pretty much be non-existent. So let's just extract this area, press Y, and we see that nothing happens. So for that reason it's set to 1600, because extraction is just one of those rarely used operations, and also the fade has been redone for this particular update, so it should be more stable than ever. So we'll just pause that here and repeat our sliver, and just like that you can now see the power of the new extract inside of Boxcutter 718.7. Fade sound effects is a bit of an Easter egg inside of Boxcutter. However, the easiest way to remember it is that by setting your display fade out time to something like 1, 2, 3, you can actually jump to one of our mini fade sound effects. So now you'll see that there's a forward and previous button which allows you to go through the various types of sound effects that are capable inside of Boxcutter. In fact, 1, 2, 3 is one of my favorites because it gives this nice little crunching sound. However, by clicking the back button, you can actually change to one of the other sound effects and just jump straight to it instead of having to guess which numbers actually activate a sound effect, in the event that you want to just experiment with it and find the perfect sound effect for your experience. So just one of those little Easter eggs. However, there are a series of things that I want to do with it just to take it to that final level, and this is just one of those long time requests that I'm glad to see finally has taken place inside of Boxcutter. Traditionally, when using Boxcutter, users are greeted with a pie menu that looks like this whenever they press D. This is what we call our utility pie. However, we've attempted to try a different type of pie to make it a little bit simpler, called Simple Pie. To enable Simple Pie, you just go under the Behavior sprocket, and under Display you can choose Simple Pie. From here, pressing D will actually bring out a more simplified version of Pi where our main options, custom, N-gon, box, and circle, will remain in the same place as they're supposed to be. One of the small changes that we've made in this particular version with Simple Pi is that in the event that you're, say, using wedge box, and you're just performing your wedge box and everything's just going well, of course, make sure you select your surface, but you're just performing wedge box as you normally would, and you wanted to reset it, you would just press D and just jump back to box, and now you've actually reset wedge box to just go back to being just a regular box, which is the preferred way to work. However, you're not supposed to actually have wedge as a state that jumps over to circle, because having a circle wedge is something that's typically undesired when using Boxcutter, unless you explicitly are aiming for it. So this is just something that we aim to do in this particular version, was make it where whenever you jump to the options, they actually jump to their default states instead of retaining previous parameter changes from other operations in the event that you're just jumping around with shapes and experimenting. So this should make things play along a lot better for everyone. I received a couple of messages from users where they were saying things like, how did I end up in wedge circle? And it was because of a small oversight with our Simple Pi, more than likely, that resulted in the states actually being kept between shape changes, which is something that wasn't supposed to be that way. So just letting you know that Simple Pi continues to get better. Even though it's simple, there's a lot of ponderance that goes behind the way that these options correlate with each other and the way that they reset whenever you go in and actually set it to a particular state and then reselect it. So we'll just have to see what the future holds for this Pi, but just letting you know that it's on its way to getting better and better. Traditionally in Boxcutter, you could perform a cut by just clicking and dragging and then releasing. You'll jump into the extrusion operation where the extrusion will attempt to follow your mouse cursor. This means that by moving it left to right, you're not going to see much movement except for it registering on the vertical. And this is a quite simple way to perform an extrusion. However, whenever you're looking at things head on, it does make things a little bit difficult. For example, right here, you see I'm unable to give any sort of depth to this shape, leaving me no choice but to just left click and perform a view extrude. Of course, I could draw the shape and then rotate the view and then of course adjust the depth, which is a traditional way that we've been working. However, underneath our behavior sprocket under input is an option for something called alternative extrude. And what this means is that instead of registering it the way it did previously, it now uses the amount of movement that you give it after drawing the shape in order to determine how far to cut through the shape. So this is nice and all. However, View Extrude has never supported custom cutter, which was a little bit limiting. And to show that in action, let's actually press D and switch over to custom cutter. And by looking at this face head on, we can draw a Boxcutter logo. And if I move it out, we see that View Extrude is able to work with custom and extrude just like it would with box. But notice that when I hold shift to try to get a one-to-one cut, that isn't actually supported. So I can't actually get a one-to-one cut with the Boxcutter logo. I am able to rotate my view, which will break me out of View Extrude. And then from there, by pressing shift, I can actually lock this state in a one-to-one form. And this is actually just too much work to have to drop out of a mode in order to just activate a behavior that should be solid across all our shapes. Just like I was discussing with Autodepth, this is something we also want to solve with custom cutter and view align. So let's go in and we just want to make sure Autodepth is off, and under input we just want to turn on alternative extrude, and we'll just draw our box, and we see that now we're able to extrude based on the amount of movement that the mouse is making instead of the position of the mouse on the screen. So if you're a new user, this is something that could require some getting used to if you experiment with, but definitely has its possibilities for increased usability. For example, being able to cut to a depth from this particular angle is something that was previously an impossibility. However, now we're able to determine the amount of depth just by looking at the extrude amount and looking at it from a static head-on view. So if we press D and we switch over to custom, we'll draw custom just like before, and we can extrude all the way through just like we could before. However, if I hold shift, we see that we're able to view extrude and get a one-to-one result, which allows us to actually pause this at an adequate depth proper for the Boxcutter logo. So it's letting you know that there's been some small changes whenever it comes to view extrude. Even though it's something that not a lot of users are using, it's something that we still are in the process of trying to improve to become adequate enough to become a default. Another thing about it is that view extrude also now supports dots. So if we pause it and we grab this dot, we can now hold shift while grabbing this extrude dot, even in this 2D state, left click, right click to pause it, and we see that we were able to pause it in a 1-to-1 state. So 1-to-1 with view extrude not only supports shift inherently, as you saw with this cut, it also supports it whenever you're using a dot to modify the state, even in a 2D state, which will definitely come in handy in a pinch. New to this version is also some slight changes to the way that the top bar formatting for Snap is associated. If we look in this area, we see that there's now a top bar label for Snap in addition to a new lock icon, which I'll be going over more in depth. If we were to press F4 and bring up our preferences, we can actually go into the Boxcutter preferences, and underneath display, there's an option for the snap label in case you want to get rid of the snap label and have it look like it did traditionally. However, with it on, you at least are aware of the state of snapping in Boxcutter at its present time. So whenever you first enable snap, we see that it says dots, which means that by holding control and hovering over the surface, we see that snap dots are appearing, which I'll be going over more in depth later. If we click the icon next to it, we see that grid is enabled, where we can see the new grid in action. And by holding control, we can see that we're able to actively scan the surface and ray trace on it, looking for that perfect angle to work off of for us to begin our cut. However, this icon at the end is a new one, which is increment lock, which is soon to become snap lock. And basically what this means is that by tapping control, you can start a grid snapping, but you don't no longer have to hold control the entire time. So this was something that we've been working on improving, and over time it should be getting even better than it is in its current form. But we just wanted to take some steps to making these options a little more focal for users. Whenever you're in grid lock mode, you can press escape to remove the grid off screen, and by just unchecking that, we can go back to working the way that we were previously. So really that's all there is when it comes to the top bar changes when it comes to snap in the top bar. However, if we open a button or bring the drop down out for snap, we see that there's also been some option changes here. For the most part, increment snap hasn't changed, and neither has the enabling of snap grid to allow us to go in and choose how much we want to snap. You'll see that also static now has parameters for both grid and dots. So static grid and dots are two systems that we've been working on as kind of a backup in the event of failure, and now they finally have a dedicated location where users can toggle these behaviors off and on the fly, which I'll be going over more in depth. Rotation angle is still where it was, which is basically the amount of rotation that happens when you press R, but also notice that there's now a fade timing system set up for dots. So right now I have mine set to 50, which means that it takes about 50 milliseconds to come in, but it takes about 1200 in order to leave. And we can actually lower this down to something like 50, and dots behave like they would traditionally, where the moment you release control, they actually disappear. But there's just something about seeing them last around for a moment and fade out gently that just touches a groove with me. So another thing is whenever grid's enabled, grid also has fade capabilities as well. So right now we see that the grid comes in at the speed of light. However, it leaves after about 6 milliseconds or 60 milliseconds. Let's actually raise this to 1200 as well. And now we see that I'm able to just drop grids repeatedly, and they just fade out one by one. But we'll be going over that in this more dedicated section. But just letting you know that we've taken some steps towards streamlining the snap area, and you'll see it continuously get better over the next versions, but it is something that we're working on in the background. When it comes to getting acquainted with snapping in Boxcutter, just looking at the top bar, we see that there's a magnet icon that when you enable, puts you in the dot state. In fact, clicking the next icon will actually switch you over to grid, but for now we'll be talking about dots. So with dots enabled, by holding control and hovering over the surface, we see that dots appear, which by clicking and dragging will allow us to use them as a jump off point for what we're attempting to do here. So right here I'm actually holding Alt and clicking and dragging off of that dot in order to drag from that middle point, and then I'm beveling the shape, holding control again in order to grab a different dot, and just working this middle area. In fact, this time I don't actually need a dot, I'll just create this cut on the surface. However, I'll hold control and grab this middle point in order to expand on this particular area. So that's really, in a nutshell, how you would use dots inside of Boxcutter. New to this version is the ability to set fade timing. So right now you can see that when I hold control and release, there's a nice little fade whenever the dots are exiting the screen. If you want, you can change this to something a little lower, where the moment you release control, everything actually just leaves the surface immediately. And you can do the same thing with the entry time. So right here I have a entry and exit time of 0, and dots will behave just like they would before, where they would come and leave immediately on the release and press of Control. So let's press Control N and make a new file, and here we can talk about some of the expansions when it comes to dots. So new to this version with the traditional dot system is also the ability to have world dot. So if I just press X and delete this cube, we see that we have a single dot on the surface indicating our world, and I could even roll the wheel to adjust basically the grid size, which we can see at the bottom here being changed. And what this allows me to do is basically draw utilizing dots just in the context of world. So in this case, it actually isn't working very well because it's not snapping the second point. We see that we're able to snap the first point, but the moment we begin drawing, we're not able to snap. This is because we need to enable increment lock. So now with increment lock, when we begin drawing, we're actually able to draw precisely to that 0.5. So with this, you can actually draw using a world dot without a whole lot of issue. And this is something that's exclusive to the default dots, which we refer to as the dynamic dot system. Alternative to this is the static dot system, which was introduced in the last version, but now has a area proper for users to go in and get acquainted with it. So we'll talk more about that in just a moment, but for now I'm just drawing some shapes utilizing increment lock along with dots in order to draw precisely. In addition to this, we also have view dots. So view dots was something that was around previously. We'll create a cube for this, and basically if you begin drawing off of the shape, you're utilizing view. And the same thing with dots. If we use control off of the mesh, we see that we are able to draw using this view dot and also snap to it, giving us the experience of a grid, but with the simplicity of just a single dot. So sometimes this is a way that I like to work whenever I'm creating things in a rather precise fashion. Of course, I'm able to roll the wheel in order to lower the amount of distance in between each increment in the event that I need to get something a little more fine. But just like that, we're able to now use world dots and view dots inside of Boxcutter once again. Previously, we talked about dynamic dots and how it's the basic default of Boxcutter. However, there's a secondary system of dots called static dots, which can be enabled by using the static toggle for dots in the static area, where we see that instead of fade options, we now have options pertaining to the static dot system. There's a couple of behavioral differences too whenever it comes to static dots. For example, when you're holding control, we see that there's no change with the dots as we hover over them except for a slight size change. We can also press tab and pause these dots, and you could also even press escape in order to unpause and just remove the dots. In fact, we can hold control and press spacebar, and that will also pause these dots on screen. And this can lead to some really interesting combinations. So for example, let's select this top face. We'll just press I to inset. And with this face, we'll just give it a couple of subdivisions. And we see that another difference between static dots and dynamic dots is dots for static don't actually update when you roll your mouse over the surface. In fact, they remain underneath your cursor where it originated. So for this reason, static dots has its own special place inside of Boxcutter. However, it is a much more limited system, but that's not to say that we haven't expanded on it multifold in this particular update. So one of the things with snap dots now is, with us looking at this face, we can hold control and shift and actually roll the dots in order to subdivide them. So now we've subdivided this face and just added some additional dots. Previously I was showing how if I subdivided the face, we would only be able to see dots for a particular area. If we were to change this back to dynamic, you can see what would normally be expected with using dots on the surface. But with static, it's just static. So for the sake of demonstration, we'll just press Q. Under operations, we'll choose clean mesh, which will get rid of any extra dots. And so let's just hold control shift and roll these dots. And this is one of the new additions with this particular update, is the ability to subdivide dots, which will allow you to do things like this. Normally, whenever you perform a cut on the surface, the configuration of dots would change, which prevents you from being able to perform repetitive cuts in a sequential fashion. And this is something that I wanted to have resolved in one of the previous updates, but I'm glad we finally got around to it. So now you can see that no matter how many times I cut, the dots remain absolutely static, really leading up to its name. Right there I made a mistake, so I just pressed undo, and we see how undo is able to even persist and keep the dots up on screen, which is something that can't be said about most other systems. So let's continue working and just putting all these objects in the surface just to completely fill it up. and done. And just like that, you've now seen dot subdivision in action. So when it comes to the parameters, dot to dot snap allows you to snap from one dot to another dot. In fact, let's turn off increment snap to simplify this, and we see that when I drag from this dot, everything is free, but if I get to this dot, it will snap to it. So this is something that was around in the previous version. However, we're experimenting with ways to bring back this behavior in another fashion. So that's why you're seeing it at this state, at this time. So let's just right click, that is dot to dot snapping. The next one is alignment preview, which when it's enabled will basically make the dot show an alignment preview of what you're about to be drawing whenever you begin clicking and dragging. This can come in handy for times where we'll put an edge across. If we were to shift V and switch to nearest edge, we see that this dot's going to draw in a straight fashion like we've been used to. However, if we hover over this dot, we see that we're about to draw in a method that's actually oriented to this particular edge because we're using nearest edge at this time. So alignment preview can come in handy for cases where you want to see what you're about to be doing with snapping prior to it actually being used. The next one we'll be talking about is subdivision preview. So we talked about how you could hold Control Shift and perform a subdivision on the dots in order to subdivide them. However, this will actually show you a grid letting you know which dot is face, which one's edge, just in case you need a visual indicator for additional information. So this one isn't really needed for anything in particular, but it does serve as a nice diagnostic measure to just see what's going on with the surface. Of course, face subdivision doesn't happen when you're dealing with a non-quad or a non-flat face. If you're dealing with something that's an n-gon, you'll only be able to subdivide edges. So just know that that's a limitation of the system, and in those cases you would probably want to actually use grid. For example, we see that now whenever I attempt to subdivide, I'm no longer subdividing, I'm no longer subdividing the faces, I'm only subdividing the edges, which is almost useless. But if we press escape to get out of that, we can talk about some of the other behaviors that are interesting with snap. One of the things I like doing with snap is pausing to keep a jump off point for later. So for example, we have this cylinder. We'll press Control and begin snapping. We'll press Tab in order to pause it. If I were to press D and jump to circle and we begin drawing a circle, and we press taper and bring this down and begin adjusting the auto smooth, we see that we're not able to get to this rim anymore. And we used to have a feature called Simple Trace that would allow us to do this. However, now I see that that potential is able to be handled by simple dots, at least at this time. And one of the benefits of having your dots paused like this is, let's say I wanted to draw a box, but I wanted to radial array it. Well, now I can radial array around the center because I have a previously paused state. Let's say that we applied this and we got rid of it and we wanted to begin snapping from the center again. Well, we see that we're actually unable to. So one of the things that I've been actually experimenting with personally to get used with is the possibility of just going under the modifier tab and just choosing toggle modifiers and then bringing up dots, pausing them, pressing Q, and then toggling the modifiers back on. And now we see that we now have a dot in the center that we're able to use to jump off of. So sometimes frozen dots can come in handy for giving you access to areas that are no longer accessible because they've been cut and the data's just been changed. So this is one of the big benefits that comes with snap dots, and really just the tip of the iceberg. So when it comes to dots and snapping, just enabling snap will allow you to begin using dots when you press Control and hover over the surface. With dynamic, there's also some behavioral differences. Notice that whenever I hold Control and begin dragging over this, that I'm able to freely bring this out using center draw, versus if we change over to the static system and we begin playing off of this, we see that we actually have to press Alt, which is similar to our classic system, in order to begin expanding out. So static dots has some differences in behavior compared to dynamic because of the ways that the systems differ. However, in case you're wondering why there's two different systems for dots, it's because stability can be variable across different systems. So for that reason, we've created two different systems for dealing with snapping in order to ensure that no matter what sort of system or issues that you might be experiencing related to OS or drivers or whatever, that you're still able to utilize snapping in your project and get to the end of your goal. So for the most part, dots is something that's just there for whenever you need it, but it isn't a mandatory system by any means. In fact, a big question internally is why don't we just replace dots with grid? However, I'm completely against that because I feel that dots have a very specific place in our tool, allowing users to be able to perform the operations that they need at the time that they need. Just a small operational thing being done at the time that doesn't need to become a long drawn out system, which is what you would get whenever you begin activating grid. Not to say that grid isn't accessible enough, but that dots is intended to just be a little bit more accessible whenever it comes to just creating shapes and starting out. So I've gotten quite used to the differences between static dots and dynamic. However, I must say that the behavior changes that we've made with dynamic definitely shine through and is one of my favorite things about it, especially the ability to use snapping and just jump off of midpoint without having to hold alt. So just something to keep in mind whenever you're using both of these systems is there are some differences in behaviors. I did talk about how dots have the ability to have a view dot, allowing you to snap with view in the event that you need such a thing. And this is something that simply isn't present with static. Same thing with world dot. If we deselect it and we press control, we see that nothing's happening in static, and that's because static is primed for stability, while our dynamic system is something that we aim to have be a little bit more experimental and definitely custom made for the Boxcutter experience. So now we see that we have our single dot back for drawing on the world, where we can begin drawing just on the grid floor just like that, and then selecting the object we can begin just drawing out of the face and doing what we would normally do with an object to begin detailing it using Boxcutter. Previously we had discussed how the previous grid that was in Boxcutter, the infinite grid, was undergoing some changes, and that in a future update we would be seeing the grid with an entirely new face. And this is what the grid looked like in the previous versions. One of the things I want you to observe is how there's a slight haze in between the cells of the grid, which was something that always kind of drove me crazy, and I wasn't sure why it was there. But there's no preference in order that's capable of actually removing that haze, and it's just a systematic issue of the way the grid was. But it was always a constant reminder to me that things could always be better with the grid. So now we jump over to the current version of Boxcutter 718.7. And enabling grid is pretty much just as easy as just clicking the grid icon in the top bar. In fact, even if you have the magnet off, you can just click on the grid icon and voila, you're in grid. And we see that there's a label that now lets us know that we're in grid. And this means that basically if we hold control, we now have a grid on the surface. We can roll the wheel just like before. In order to adjust the scale, the grid will be raycasted to the surface as we hold control. The option of adaptive is still present, where you can turn on adaptive and you'll see that the grid updates as you roll over the surface. I don't actually have much of a use of this in my own personal workflow, but it does exist as a kind of technical debugger of sorts for us to be able to quickly read what's going on with the grid. Also, when it comes to the grid, let's go ahead and put an edge here, and we'll select these 2 points and also put an edge here with J. If we press Shift V and change our orientation system to the nearest edge, we can also see that in adaptive we're able to kind of do a scanning mode where we're able to see the grid update in real time as it's locating alternative orientation modes that are generated by the geometry that's actually underlying. So a lot of the things that existed with the previous version of grid is still there. However, a couple of things also have changed. For example, there's now a lock icon, which currently is connected to increment lock, but someday in the future it'll become something that I hope to call just snap lock, where basically you'll be able to tap control and leave the grid and it will be oriented. But of course you can hold control and continue the entire active scanning lifestyle even though adaptive is no longer on. So here we see that we've got a coordinate that we want. We can actually begin working off the surface, begin drawing the shape, and even if we don't highlight the dot exactly whenever we draw, it should actually jump to the nearest dot. And while we're in this state, we can still hold control, roll the wheel, and just in this mode with the lock enabled, you no longer have to hold control. So it's just a little bit more of a relaxing way to use grid if you're trying to have a more chill experience whenever it comes to using it. Of course, I'm orienting myself near an edge and pressing control again to adjust the rotation as I roll the wheel, but also keeping this as my orientation mode, because if I were to do it over here, we see that the orientation mode's getting changed. While I'm still looking at it from this flat view, I can press Alt X, press V, and even mirror this from V if I want to begin working with this as my particular viewpoint. So here I'm just holding control, locating the axis that I want to begin working on as far as orientation, working my way off of the surface, drawing a box, extruding down, pressing B to bevel. And really that's how easy it is to get acquainted with the new grid. So basically it's a facelift, but this grid is definitely capable of much more than the previous version. We put a lot of work into making grid capable of handling more cells. For example, right now we're looking at this displaying about 16 cells. In the previous update, we made our grid capable of handling 100 cells, at a reasonable speed. That was always the issue with Infinite Grid, was that speed concerns caused us to have to make the grid actually limit the amount of cells in order to keep a fast experience. But we see that even with 100 cells, that things are still going fast. And the crazy thing about this grid is that even if we jump up to, say, 500, which is an astronomical number that's just too much, we see that everything is still working fast, and we're able to even scroll back and move our grid around and see it move in action, and it's performing quick, and there's no longer a speed hang that comes up with it. So it's definitely the fastest version of our grid yet. And so with that, I can press D, jump into Ngon. Notice how the grid remains up on screen even though I brought up the D pi, and we're just drawing a shape based off of our grid. Sometimes I find grid to be a little bit dominating in terms of workflow, so I'm more privy to sometimes just use dots as a temporary jump off and rely on the systems inherent to the snapping, such as suggestive snap with the sole dot that you see pop up, and also angle lock, which allows us to snap at a particular angle no matter what line we draw. But with that, you're basically seeing the new grid in action. There's a little bit more to it than just that. So let's turn off the lock, so that way grid will go away whenever we release control. And you also see that every time I press control, the grid just shows up instantaneously, even at 500 points, which is something that has been on the wish list for a very long time when it comes to grid. I'll bring it back down to something more reasonable like 10, because you really don't need that many points when it comes to using a grid that's able to go on to infinity painted under your cursor. So another thing about grid is that there's a special fade parameter for it. So we see that currently my fade time is 0, which means that I press control, that grid pops up immediately. However, we can have some fun with this and set our fade to something like 150. There's no sound effect Easter eggs connected to grid at this time, in case you're wondering. But you know, who knows what the future holds. So we see that by setting it to 150, we have a much more graceful grid entry. In fact, let's set it to something like 300 because I'm a fan of the dramatic. And we see that now the grid comes in just ever so gently, like a summer breeze. And if we set the exit time to something crazy like 3800, we are able to basically paint grids on the surface, and they'll fade out with individual fade times, just a testament to the amount of stability that's now present in this new grid system. We've worked in the past at having fade work with shapes. We've worked on having fade work with multiple shapes at the same time in our own individual timers, and now we see the culmination of all that work in this new dynamic grid that now is able to have individual fade timers on different instances of the grid. Right now it's more of a novelty, which doesn't make any sense. However, someday in the future, we hope to be able to paint grids and have grids converge on screen and allow users to create grids based off of the underlying geometry, allowing for a more interesting snapping experience. But for now, you can just set it to something high and just watch grids fade out ever so slow. And the same thing can be said for dots. For example, let's set this to something like 4800. And we see that the dot will actually take longer to fade out than the grid, which is just an interesting way of working for me. Not saying that this is anything useful for workflow, but sometimes you just want to just have a really trippy experience whenever you're working with orientation, and on those late nights, this can definitely be a little bit more interesting. But continuing on, the final thing I want to talk about is the return of the view dot, which I talked about previously, where now there's a view dot, and if you have nothing selected, there's also a world dot. We can see that at the top it says world in the orientation area, and being red means that it's being overridden. And this is just a reminder. So this system is actually powered by the dynamic grid. So if we go under grid, we see that we have settings for the amount of spacing. So let's just set this to something like 1. And if we turn this off and we're back in dots, we see that dot is adhering to the settings that were specified by the dynamic system. Previously in the past, we had multiple dots on screen that would fade out in the distance, but that system was lost. And so in our process of getting it restored, we at least have a singular dot to just help users be more aware whenever they're working. In this case, of course, I'm not able to snap from dot to dot, and that is because I need to actually go in and increment and enable increment lock, which will enable me to snap 2 increments, which I find to be a really strict way of working. But if you're trying to draw precisely within the bounds of a particular increment, just know that increment lock is there for you, and it supports dots as well. But dots also is enhanced by grid, if that makes any sense. So a weird thing about the last version of Boxcutter, if you were to deselect a shape and say draw grid, right, and right click cancel, when you press control again, you'll have this phantom grid. And to show this in action again, I'm just going to click to begin a cut, right click to cancel, and let's try it again. Right click cancel, and it looks like I can only do it once, making a fool out of me, but you get the idea. Having a double grid on screen is just a bit of an annoyance for everyone. I mean, you're still able to work with the grid present, but every time you bring up the grid, there would always be this phantom grid. And for that reason, we also need to just replace the old system because it was showing its age. So this is something that has been resolved in the latest version. Just to show the level of solve that's been done to this, we're going to set our shape fade to something like 9,000. And we're also going to set our grid and dots up for exit fade of 9,000, just to be sarcastic. And so we're just going to draw a shape, press H to make it solid, and we're just going to snap a bunch of grids, make this fade, click on File, New, General, and we see that nothing remains in the new file. And this was something that was a bit of a problem in the last version. In fact, let's test out that same issue. Let's expand display, set our fade to something like 9,000, that was 900, and let's just click on this, bring the shape down, click on File, New, General, Don't Save, and we see that we now permanently have this shape forever. And not saying that you know, people definitely shouldn't be saving their file while a shape is fading, but definitely is something that we should have been able to take care of. So I'm happy to announce that this has also been resolved as well. When I was talking about issues with the grid and fade and stuff like that, you know, there was even a release where we had to take fade out because it was causing some instabilities. So we had to really look back and actually examine what we were going for and how we were going to execute in order to ensure that the path we were taking was the most efficient. I mean, I definitely am not the type of person who would want to get rid of any of our systems, but fade is something that we view as kind of an aesthetic on the experience, but we definitely have done all we can to ensure that it works as fluid as possible for this particular release. So one of the things in Boxcutter I've been having some fun with lately is the grid. Not the grid that I was just talking about previously, but the actual grid cut. So let's just take this cube, SZ, and scale it down. And we'll actually turn grid off for this. We could use dots. And we'll just jump over to custom cutter where nothing is marked as a custom cutter. And when we look at it from top view, we can just grab this dot to jump off. And every time I worked with Boxcutter, I think about all the bugs that have been solved. For example, there was once a time where looking at things from frontal view wouldn't actually show dots, and I'm happy to see that that's now resolved and we're able to continue working. My fade time's a little too high. Set at 9,000, it's going to be fading out way longer than I wish it was. So we'll just set it to something like 1,000. And before we continue, I'm going to press Q, and we're just going to use a smart apply clone. And with this clone, we're just going to grab these side faces, press Ctrl I, delete everything that isn't selected, and we now have this selection that we can give some solidification to. However, it looks terrible at this time, so we'll press 4 in order to use non-manifold solidify, which sometimes can give you a much nicer result. And let's select the main shape, press D, switch to box, press D, activate grid on box, and let's just draw a grid. And we're already in a good place with this. However, I could press Shift G in order to adjust it and roll the wheel and reduce the amount of squares that are here. In fact, to increase the viability of success for this, we'll just set it to something reasonable and press X in order to change it to slice. I thought I pressed X. Okay, now I pressed X for slice. Can't do it in the middle of the grid operation. Sorry about that. Let's press spacebar and complete this operation. And the first thing I'm going to do is we'll select this piece, hide it. We'll select this piece and Control A, visual geometry to mesh, select everything else, Alt P, and just clear parents because we don't want parent transformations affecting anything. And with this piece, we're just going to search for rigid body and choose add passive. And we'll select these pieces and we'll choose rigid body again. And this time we'll choose add active, and things didn't work out just yet, and it's because we need to apply to boolean, so let's go ahead and do that. Then we'll add active because we don't want any weirdness. Let's just select everything in edit mode, press P, separate by loose parts. Let's select everything again and use Shift S and use origin to geometry, and so now we have this rigid body simulation that's able to just explode. So let's Alt H, unhide everything, press 1 to go back to our main collection, get rid of this camera and light, we won't be needing it. And this is what we have so far, just the Boxcutter logo exploding out into every direction. So one of my favorite things to do in Blender is to play with the simulation settings. So let's go into rigid body world. And first thing we'll do is turn on split impulse and set our speed to something like 0.2. And let's just play it back, and we see that now it's playing back a lot slower. Another thing is we probably want to turn off gravity and just see how it looks. And this is kind of the experience that we're getting out of it so far. Some of it's exploding upwards, some of it's exploding downwards. It's going to come down to this thing and how we make it behave. That's going to determine how these pieces explode out. So changing it to mesh can give us something like that. Let's change it to box just for kicks, and we see that that just pushes it out. So the way that we actually want this to work is, let's hide this piece and hide everything else except for this, and I'm just going to snap my cursor to this area, and we'll just select everything, press period, set our pivot point to be 3D cursor, and we're just going to scale this up, Control A, scale, and now we actually have them all exploding outward. So really just kind of a quick little hack, but now we actually have the Boxcutter logo just exploding with these pieces being sent out into space. In fact, let's go into perspective and just take a look at what we have here. So just voila, just Boxcutter pieces just coming out, and this is just a kind of a fun way I've just been getting started with Boxcutter. Before I continue, let me make sure I have Commotion installed. Alright, I have Commotion installed. Over here on my end panel, I have Commotion, which is one of my favorite tools, and we'll be needing it in a moment. But before that, let's see if we want to mess with anything. I like to use a force field of turbulence, and we'll just raise that up on the Z, set the strength to something like 5,000, and see what we're getting. And let's raise the noise amount as well, and it's almost there. Let's put one more 0 on this. Alright, let's divide it by 2. Alright, that actually looks a lot better. I like it to dissolve a little bit once it comes out. And let's divide it by 2 again. Still a little strong. Still a little strong. Let's set this to something like 2. Maybe set it to 1. And let's multiply this back by 2. Multiplying by 2 is something I read in an old Blender book a long time ago that just says that, you know, by using the system of multiplying and dividing parameters, you can quickly jump back and forth between various states when working an operation. I don't know, it just stuck with me. So I'm always just dividing and multiplying things by 2. So now that we have our simulation kind of going in the direction that we want, let's select everything and let's choose bake to keyframes, and there we go. We're greeted with this little F9 window. Let's just click OK on this and just wait. It'll take a moment. There's of course a lot of pieces here. If we would have gridded it even more, we'd be waiting even longer. I don't even have to pause the recording to wait for that. I was able to hold the conversation long enough. So here we are looking at our pieces just fading up into space. And what I want to do now is, let's see, how do we want to do this? Also, is there, okay, that's the collision. Let's remove the collision. It was throwing me off, showing a little bounding box. For this piece, we could actually lower the solidification just a little bit more, just to make it really thin on it. We want to keep the purity of the Boxcutter logo. And let's see, how do we want this to explode? Do we want it to radiate from the center? Which we could press Shift C, start from the center, select everything, and just choose to basically offset this. How many do we want to offset them by? Let's say 3. And how many do we want to animate each time in this iterative circle that's going to be bounding out from our cursor? Let's say 5, and let's choose offset animation. And now we see that it's actually coming out piece by piece, which just looks a lot cooler to me. And in fact, I wonder what it would look like in reverse. So usually with these things, I always take it, record it forward, and then over the timeline press SX -1. Probably don't have to press X in the timeline, but old habits, and we bring it back down, and we're basically reforming the Boxcutter logo. However, how do we want this to take place as far as time goes? So let's bring this back. It starts here, begins building our logo. Let's bring it back a little bit more. Voila. Let's press Alt-H and play it from the beginning. And that is us making a quick grid-based MoGraph graphic of us cutting out the Boxcutter logo, and that took us less than 10 minutes. So I wanted to do some sort of demo to wrap this up, and I was meaning to do a tutorial about grid last week in this context, so now we've wrapped that up. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and with that, I'll wrap this up, and I'll see you guys next time. So we got about 5 minutes before we actually hit like a smooth hour on the timeline, even though none of that matters because I still have to add an introduction. Let's have a little bit more fun with Commotion. So I am going to jump to the end of the timeline, and we'll press H. And I was about to do this actually off camera, but I was like, why don't I just do this for the users? So let's just do it in a recording. So I'm going to select everything, and that's not going to be impacted by, you know, an effector, and we're going to press M, and we're going to move this to a collection called AFF, and we'll add another collection, and we'll just call this one EFF. And in this EFF collection, I'm going to put an empty called a sphere, and we'll make it large. And now we're going to have fun with the proximity effector area of Commotion. And first we want to choose what we're going to be animating, which is going to be AFF, and we want to choose what is going to be affecting it, and that's going to be the EFF. And we want the fall off to be, you know, whatever. We're going to be scaling all this stuff dynamically, and the main thing is the scale. So basically, if it's inside of the bounds, we want it to be 1. If it's outside the bounds, it's going to be 0. And what this should look like is that if we go back to the beginning, we now see them actually doing the opposite. They should actually be scaling in once they're entering, not the other way around. So let's set that back to 1. And now we see that these particles just kind of come into life instead of just floating out in space. Because let's say we want to make this like a reusable asset or something, right? Like, you don't want to have just a bunch of particles floating out in space, so it'll look nonsensical. But now that actually looks cool. So we could actually raise the fall off to be something even higher. And as we scrub the timeline, we can see the effects of us playing with these particular parameters. I also like playing with trail. There's a very distinctive difference that happens when you don't have it active versus when you do have it active. I suppose it's visual, you should be able to see it, but it just causes a little bit of a better effect. And so the next thing from here is that we can bake this. So let's just select everything that we have. Let's just bake it. And so we see the timeline playing and everything scaling as it's supposed to based off of our AFF and EFF. I just came up with that just over the course of just kind of working with this tool. It's just how I've become acquainted with it. So now if we turn off proximity effector and we just right click this collection, delete the hierarchy, we can select everything that's here, move it back to collection, and just pretend like we never moved everything into another collection at all for the purposes of us doing that. And if we let this play, we now have the Boxcutter logo, just pieces just coming out of another dimension. We probably could have given it a little bit more distance to fade, but you know, story for another day. That could be left up to you, the user, to improve on when you are following this or attempting this or trying this at home. So now we see the logo just voila, just coming together, and it's perfectly set up. So at this point, we could actually select everything and then select this outside, press Control P, connect it to object, and so now all the pieces are now associated with this one singular object. So I'm going to save this as gridcut_logo, and we'll save that, sponsored by PowerSave. And let's just Control S, save this, and I'm going to from here jump over to the KitOps panel, and before jumping out into KitOps, I'm going to press QOT in order to place a box around it, and we'll just click to apply that. And I want to just scale it up just a little bit, and let's also make it a wired displayed object, not through wireframe, through shade wire. And let's parent this shape to this wire object. So now this is like the main object, and if we use this as some sort of cutter, it'll at least be cut into the surface. So let's say that we wanted to save this out as an insert. I'm going to jump over to my KO export pack that I've been working on. This is just where I save all my inserts. Notice that the inserts now load at the speed of light. We are going to just save this file, maybe select both of these, and we'll choose create insert. And if we're lucky, basically everything, even our children, should end up in this new create an insert file. We'll just give that just a moment, and we are here. So I'm selecting the outside. Actually, there's some pieces here that probably do not need to be present. That one needs to be present. That one does not. And so if we change this to cutter, we are cooking with gas, working in Flavor Town with location. And basically if we go and play our timeline, we can get something like this, which would make for a really trippy thumbnail, right? So let's just save this as BC logo HardOps, and we'll just save it as it is. Save insert. And I wish I would have just saved the insert instead of showing a pop-up, but from here we can render our thumbnail. I don't know why my camera got moved. It's probably because I clicked camera to insert. Sorry about that. No problem, we'll just reposition our camera. We'll choose render thumbnail, and after a brief hold, and I mean a very brief hold because I have a 3090, we've now rendered our thumbnail. So we can close our factory scene. This file was saved already in an advantageous state before, so we don't need it. And let's just press Control N and jump over to HardOps, jump to our KO export, locate where we saved BC logo, and choose to add an insert. So now we've added our insert, and we see that the parenting just got all out of whack with this thing. So looks like we have to do a little bit more editing. Let's go back, we'll edit and check out what we have. So this thing as a parent isn't localized. This thing as a parent isn't localized. All the pieces go into place as they're supposed to. Oh God, no. Alright, let's try this again. Let's revert the file. So they do enter properly at that point. If we apply location, we see that they jump a bit. So let's try this a different way. So we're at the end of the timeline. This is the first time I've tried to make one of these inserts, so we get to go through the troubleshooting together. Let's select everything, Alt P, clear parent, keep transformation, well, Alt P. We want to clear parent and keep transformation, which I guess isn't going to be in the cards for us today. So we'll select these two elements, 3 elements, press Control I to select all of these, and we'll just bring this down. But before we do that, let's actually select all 3 of these elements and do a Control A, location, rotation, and scale, just because we don't want any sort of wackiness. And then we grab all of these, bring them precisely to where they're supposed to be, and we want to parent them actually to the grate because the grate's a stable parent. So Control P, and so this object is the main insert. So we want to make sure that both the grate and the rim are parented to this piece. Anytime an issue occurs, I just kind of jump into troubleshooting mode because I'm not only curious in the solution, but curious in the problem. And here we see Blender just took out my entire session in vengeance because they knew I was getting close to the answers. So we're just going to pop that baby back up and solve it. And we're back under BC grid logo. We have it built the way it's supposed to. Let's select everything, Alt P, clear and keep transformation. Select these 3, apply all transforms, rotation and scale, just being superstitious. And with wire see-through mode, we're just going to grab everything and bring it down precisely here. Select the grate, Control P, keep transform, select both of these, parent them to the bounding box, which will be the main shape. And if we open our HardOps panel, we can choose to make this the main object. And let's just press Control, or let's just choose Save Insert from this panel, and then make a new file. And let's see if HardOps is going to make a fool out of us again. So let's jump over to KO Export, BC logo, and we plan our insert. And if we let that play back, what do we get? We get all of our pieces jumping into place. In fact, let's turn off relationship lines for it, and we see that the positions are still just a little off. Why is it messing with me? And we see it definitely happening there. So let's just grab everything except for this. Almost feel like I need to just modify this last frame that everything's taking place on. But instead of doing that, I'm going to just press QOT and then change it to an empty. And for the parenting, which is located under P, we could turn parenting on, but we could also make it inverse, where everything is parented to this particular empty. And this means that whenever we let go, we're now controlling everything like so. So I'm just going to bring it down manually. I don't know why this is so determined to give me the business. Not trying to turn this Boxcutter video into a HardOps video, but did want to create a cool insert out of it at the very end of the video. So now we see that we are getting a satisfactory result. Let's press Control S, make a new file, and then we'll press N, open HardOps, jump over to KO Export, and we'll choose our BC logo insert. And let's turn off relationship lines for it, and we just let it play back. And that is the result that we were going for. So it looks like we have to use a bit of an offset parenting method in order to get it to work exactly as intended. But just wanted to end this tutorial on a good note.